basically into 1945, right? And this is obviously a very long story, and we could spend literally a whole semester talking about this. So this is going to be very brief. We're just going to, touch on a couple of issues. But for the United States, already in sort of towards the end of World War II, obviously, the policymakers in Washington started to think about sort of, okay, so how are we gonna organize world politics and the global system once this war comes to an end, right? And the big sort of lesson that they drew from the experiences and the mistakes and the errors that had been made in the interwar period was that we can't go back to that sort of old way of doing politics, right? This sort of classic, competitively based great power politics, right? Where we're all jostling for, power and influence and all of that without sort of commonly agreed rules, right? How world politics should be managed. So we're gonna move basically to the opposite, right? We're gonna actually finish what Wilson originally was imagining, right? Post World War I, which was a rules-based, multilaterally organized global system, right? It just didn't work out during the interwar period. Part of the reason for that was because the US wasn't fully ready to commit to something like that, right? The US wasn't really willing to take over sort of a leadership role during those 2 decades. But it was very much willing to do so after 1945. So what came out of that, I have two more things basically before we get into sort of what this actually means. So a rules-based international system, right? The second element that obviously influenced the United States very strongly was the early Cold War, right? I mean, 1945 is sort of, those are the early beginnings of the Cold War, right? A realization that the Soviet Union was probably going to become a competitor, right, at the global stage. And the realization that the Soviet Union would have to be balanced, globally speaking, right? So this whole containment strategy sort of originated during that time period too. And the third element, I think, which is really characteristic of US foreign policy is sort of exceptionalism, right? Manifest destiny, right? So this idea that the United States is in many ways a very special power, right, in world politics. It always represented particular aspirations, right? My students often get this actually right away. They get this right when I ask them about this. They will say, well, it's democracy, right? The rule of law, the freedoms, a commitment to a free market economy, and things like that, right? And so exceptionalism relates to that idea that basically everybody on this planet should be able to enjoy that, right? So that this country actually does have, or at least thought of itself for a long time as having that mission, right, of bringing these things to other people around the planet too, right? So we can't get into the details. Have you always lived up to that? Probably not, right? Have we undermined these aspirations and ideals at times for the sake of just power politics, right? Yes, of course, right? But as an aspiration, I think it's been there for a very long time, right? So all of these things together basically motivate the United States to take on this job of formulating and designing and bringing others on board in that effort to create that more rules-based system, right? And we have a term for these kinds of powers in world politics that take on this challenge, this task. We call them a liberal hegemon, right? So liberal is a hegemon. A hegemon is a country that has just significantly more power resources than anybody else in the system, right? You're welcome. And so that comes with a couple of, should we say, responsibilities or tasks. A liberal hegemon, for example, provides so-called public goods, right? Think about something like the US Navy, right, that keeps is active around the world and keeps international sea lanes open, right? That's a public good, right? Because you pay for the Navy to do that, right? But everybody else profits basically from those open sea lanes. Another public good are, for example, security guarantees to allies, right? So that's a public good, right? In this case today, with regard to nuclear arms, nuclear security, it would be the nuclear umbrella that the United States sort of expanded to its allies in Europe, and also countries like Japan, Australia, right? So this is a public good because that means other countries can sort of count on the US to step in should they ever get attacked by somebody else, right? So that's sort of the whole idea behind this. But it can also mean, for example, making the effort to turn the US dollar into a global reserve currency, right? I mean, it is the global reserve currency in which the global economy at this point couldn't function without the US dollar, right? So the list would go on and on and on. It could also be the Marshall Plan, for example, right? The Marshall Plan is also one of these public goods creating tools that the United States implemented after World War II, right? I mean, in this case, providing loans to countries in Europe, right, for reconstruction, right? So this is a very long list, but that's all of this is typical for a so-called liberal hegemon, right? In terms of more concrete, practical things that were done, well, the United States was the leader in motivating other countries to sign on to the Bretton Woods organizations, right? The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. We got eventually the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, right? So this whole commitment to also organize and manage the global economy, right, based on certain rules and mutually agreed upon policies, right? NATO, right, the Transatlantic Defense Alliance is another tool that was used, right, to stabilize Europe, protect it from potential Soviet aggression, right? But also create, and here's another public good, collective security, right? This famous Article 5 in the NATO treaty, right? That basically, I always call this the Four Musketeer thing, right? One for all and all for one. That applies to foreign aggression, right? So the Soviet Union, for example, but it also always applies to all the member countries. Let's say the Germans go nuts again, and start thinking about attacking the French yet again, then the others would basically, the other alliance members would defend France against Germany, right? So that's the whole idea of collective security. There's a outward-looking dimension, and there's sort of the inward-looking dimension to this, right? So collectively, all of these things actually create a rather surprisingly stable, right, system, obviously for the Western Hemisphere, right? The Soviet Union did its own thing in the East, right? But it is actually working, right? This rules-based multilateral system. It also involves the UN, right? It's not just NATO, right? It's the UN sort of as a global organization, right? In which the United States also is obviously a leading force, right? So here we see this. Sorry, I thought you. No, it's okay. Here we go. So that's the. Sorry about that. So that's basically like a visual depiction of these sort of spheres during the Cold War, right? You have everything in blue, everything in dark blue is NATO, everything in this red, like strong red, is the Warsaw Pact, and then in lighter blues you have sort of allies around the world. Everything that's gray was part of the so-called non-aligned movement, right? So these were countries that were sort of trying to exist between the two spheres, right? And that actually included my native Austria too, right? As a neutral country, we were sort of we couldn't legally, we could not be part of any of those alliances, right? That was the whole point. Okay, so what did this? So how? What did this? What did this all have to do with nuclear politics, right? Well, you're familiar with the story, right, of how nuclear arms came about. You know that the United States briefly had a monopoly on nuclear powers, and you also know, I'm sure, that the Soviet Union was catching up rapidly, right? So the Cold War, long story short, was stayed cold because of nuclear power, nuclear arms, right? We had a balance of terror. We had eventually mutually assured destruction, right? And that means that if anybody ever pushes the trigger and sets off a nuclear exchange, it would be suicidal. Right? And so that's the perverse sort of logic of nuclear deterrence, right? That the more nuclear arms you have, the more stable, so to speak, the relationship becomes, because you know that any first strike will be, there will be retaliation after the first strike. So, however, this stabilizes the Western Hemisphere, right? Because it also means that a lot of other countries, because of these extended security guarantees, didn't have to think about acquiring their own nuclear arms, right? There were only within the Western Hemisphere, Great Britain and France that had nuclear arms, right? And well, the French, obviously, because they're just French and they want their own thing, right? They don't trust the Americans, right? So maybe this was a wise decision in the long run, right? Who knows, right? But what I show you here, it's a little probably a little too small for the audience in the back. But here you see sort of the buildup of nuclear arms throughout the Cold War and also post-Cold War. So blue is the United States and red is the Soviet Union, right? So obviously you see the build-up here in the 60s, 70s, and then the peak is sort of mid-80s. You also see that the Soviet Union had way more nuclear arms than the US, but eventually that was also sort of the beginning of the end, right? Because the Soviet Union just over invested in these capabilities, and that was its downfall eventually. And then you see sort of post-Cold War, the dramatic sort of disarmament, right? Arms reduction. But don't worry, we still have enough to destroy the planet multiple times over, right? So it's just, it shows you sort of this logic, right, of having just so many nuclear arms that was actually not really an option, right? Some people have called this, I mean, it's kind of fascinating when you think about it, right? You're spending billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars on something that you hopefully actually will never use, right? And so people have called this the Baroque arsenal, right? It's just sitting here, you know, you can look at it, you know, and it's like the Ferrari, right? You'll never take it out for a drive, right? Yeah, so what you also see here is always, so, you know, especially after the Cuban Missile Crisis, everybody was like, whoa, this is way too, you know, like, we gotta, we gotta find a way to rein this in, right? And so that's really when the two superpowers start thinking about managing sort of nuclear arms together, right? So that's the beginning of a phase where this negotiated nuclear arms agreements, right? So this was either arms control, right, where they kind of monitor each other and also say, listen, we shouldn't develop certain things, right? Where it was arms reduction, where they basically both agreed to get rid of certain types of nuclear arms, right? So, for example, short-range nuclear arms, right? So this was a way for them to sort of manage this a little more responsibly, right? And that kept the number of nuclear states, like states with military nuclear capabilities, down, right? For quite a while, right? And what is really important in that context is the so-called NPT treaty. So this is the Non-Proliferation Treaty that was signed in 1968. The NPT treaty basically countries that sign on to it, and most countries in the world have signed on to it, basically say we're committed to not developing nuclear arms, but it allows countries to use nuclear technology for civilian purposes, right? Like energy production. There's a little bit of obviously tied to medical research, right? Um, but that is monitored, right? The NPT treaty is a tightly monitored agreement. The organization that's responsible for monitoring this is the International Atomic Energy Agency, which sits in Vienna, Austria. And those are the people who sort of go and visit nuclear reactors. Those are the ones that overview the flow of nuclear material, where it's stored, and so on and so on. So that was basically the deal here, right? And that overwhelmingly sort of worked, right? Now, the end of the Cold War obviously results in a very unique situation. I remember distinctly when I began my undergraduate studies in 1995 at the University of Salzburg. We started reading articles in the international relations focused courses on the United States being the lonely superpower, all alone, right? Because the other one was gone, right? The Soviet Union had vanished, and the United States is sort of the last man standing, right? And from here on out, it's all gonna be beautiful and sunny, and everybody's gonna be happy, and everybody's gonna adopt democracy, and everybody's gonna buy into the global economy, right? Which obviously was further liberalizing or liberalized during that time, right? And all of this obviously under the leadership of the United States, right? So it's now no longer just, democracy and free markets for the West. It's something that gets increasingly expanded to other world regions, right? And so this, what I call the Pax Americana, right, sort of expanded dramatically. Interestingly, the alliance system survives, like NATO didn't disappear, right? And that was not necessarily predicted by a lot of scholars. A lot of scholars thought, oh, this will vanish, right? Because the main purpose of NATO, the main reason why NATO was created, the Soviet Union no longer existed. But countries decided that they were going to keep it as a sort of an insurance policy. And there was also a time where NATO, I mean, they certainly went through an identity crisis, right? But they found new purpose, right? Thanks to ongoing conflicts on Europe's periphery. For example, the wars in Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia. And so the new sort of main responsibility became crisis management, right? So-called out-of-area missions. So out of area meaning outside of the alliance territory, right? And that became really sort of a big change in strategy, right? And purpose. And that fell together with massive reductions, right? Military reductions, right? I mean, a lot of armies sort of shrank. If we no longer expected to fight the Soviet army, right? So it's a whole new paradigm in security that came out. Non-proliferation continues to work. In retrospect, maybe it was a mistake, but we convinced the Ukraine, right, to give up its 1,800 warheads, right, and return them to Russia. Because they just happened they were stationed in the Ukraine, and particularly the US was very concerned with, the Ukraine's, this newly independent country's ability to really manage these nuclear arms responsibly. So in order to prevent the disappearance, right, of material, fission material, we convinced them to accept money and some vague security guarantees in exchange for handing them over to the Russians, right? So yeah, now from a global perspective, though, it's still all of this period, right? The 90s is clearly, it's a US decade, right? I mean, there's really no other superpower around, right? So the US can really sort of enjoy this unipolar moment. And Russia obviously is severely weakened during the 90s. So, and then we have this sort of, from that point on, like starting in the 2000s, now in hindsight, actually, things start slowly to change, right? I mean, it always takes a long time for these things to sort of become clearer. But there are these sort of various steps that push the system toward multipolarity, right? And I would say it starts with 9/11 and then the following wars, right? The interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq, which obviously we all remember, the financial crisis, in the sense that they represent new challenges, right? But they also create sort of the first little fissures, right? The like a tensions, right? Tensions between maybe the allies, right? Different ways of looking at these issues, right? A red line now in hindsight was certainly Russia's annexation of Crimea. I mean, that should have been a sort of, all alarm. I mean, alarm bells did go off, but we just didn't fully understand what this was really, that this was a precursor, right, to something else. This was a testing of the West's resolve, right, to reign in Russia. And I must say, we all failed miserably, right? On the side of the US, the Obama administration was just preoccupied with other things, right? And in Europe, we still were following this sort of idea that we can somehow like bring Russia into the fold, right? Mostly through economic interdependence, right? We just trade with the Russians and sort of like hope for the best, right? Um, I think in the US something similar was going on with regard to China, right? There was still a lot of, and that's kind of like ideologically or philosophically the aftermath of the sort of the 90s, right? That you hope that when these countries sort of trade with others, and hopefully this will create a middle class and there will be sort of a push towards democracy, right? And it just didn't pan out that way, right? And the Germans certainly were following that logic, right? They thought, oh, if we really have this close economic relationship with Russia, then we'll see political reforms, right, and social changes in Russia, and that just ultimately didn't happen, right? Okay, which brings me to again now. So what happened with U.S. foreign policy after that? Well, Obama was sort of already telling Europeans, for example, nicely, guys, you gotta do more for your defense, right? You really gotta do more for your defense, right? But then it was sort of present the burden sharing debate goes back to the 70s in NATO, right? That has been around for a long time. But it was always presented as sort of a sort of polite nudging, right? Of can you do a little more for yourself? Trump, the first Trump administration, then is very blunt, right, and very outspoken, and says, "Guys, we're serious, right? You gotta spend way more." You know? So that was the first wake up for Europeans, right? It was like, now you have to imagine that's after 60 years of a relationship that was very stable, right? And everybody played their role, and everybody was more or less happy with that. That came as a little bit of as a shock, right? Because it's one thing to tell alliance partners, "Hey, you got to spend more, right? And everything's going to change now. We're going back to larger power politics, right? And no, that implies, you got to bring the populations in these countries also sort of to the realization that that's maybe the case, right? Now, to tell the Germans after World War II, where they basically reinvented themselves, as a civilian power and actually really abhor military violence, that they have to sort of undo all of this, right, and reinvent themselves yet again. And the Germans are like, I do not trust myself with a lot of military, power. Like, it makes me uncomfortable. Don't make me do that, right? It takes time, right?
Yeah.
So, and that was the same for a lot of other countries, right? I mean, to the best of my own knowledge, there were very few countries that sort of maintained sort of more or less their Cold War military posture, right? And an interesting case is Finland, right? Finland never reduced military spending after the end of the Cold War. They maintained their readiness and everything. Smart people. They were like, yeah, I remember the winter war against the Red Army, and we're not doing this again, right? So a lot of other countries had to sort of, change their mindset, right, and get into that sort of new headspace. So Trump certainly is a sort of a rupture, right? Biden is an interregnum, right? He comes back to the sort of classic transatlanticist, right? Supporting NATO, right? Supporting the Ukraine. More or less, right? I mean, I would argue that there has been a pivot away from Europe, right? Because just in the larger picture, Southeast Asia becomes just more pressing, right? Geopolitically speaking. But and Biden continues actually a lot of policies that Trump initiated, right? If you just think about economic policies, right? Industrial policies, right? He let the tariffs stay, right? That Trump imposed. So there's a lot of continuity, right? But again, during the Biden administration, all of this gets a little packaged. It's packaged nicer, right? And it comes a little less sort of forceful, right? The message, but the message was certainly there. And now, obviously, the last year has been, shall we say, turbulent, right? Because now it's just basically the Trump on steroids, right? Now everybody really is struggling, right? And scrambling, right? The Europeans are scrambling, right?
I'll go to the next one.
We spent too much time on this one slide. One back. No. There we are. So now, of course, it's partly it's a repeat from the first Trump administration, but as you all know, the first Trump administration was a little more coherent, right? Because there were still people in there that actually more or less subscribed to that old sort of transatlantic model of providing security, right? So now it's different, right? I mean, this constant sort of questioning of the US's commitment to NATO, right, in Article 5, and particularly the question of, well, can we still trust the nuclear security guarantees, right, has really created a lot of nervousness and insecurity in Europe, right? All these arms control agreements that you saw in that table, they've all expired, except for one. The New START agreement, strategic arms reduction treaty that was signed in 2010 will expire, I think, next Thursday. And that's the last nuclear agreement between Russia and the US that was still sort of active. Everything else has expired. So we're moving basically in an era now where there are no sort of agreements or commitments, right, to rein in the nuclear arms race, right? So, and that's a first in 50 years, basically. Right? And nobody has said anything about this, but you don't hear FIP, certainly not from the Russians, but also not from the United States these days. So it's almost like, yeah, everybody is just waiting and starting to invest, like reinvest in nuclear arms at this point. Right? There's a lot of talk and actually a lot of money is being put into innovations at this point, modernization. I think the US already under the first Trump administration committed $80 billion to modernizing the nuclear arsenal. Right? So because it's old, right? And it's decaying and it needs an update, right? But we also have other technological innovations like hypersonic missiles, right? That can circumvent defensive measures, right? So there is a lot of movement happening again in an arms technology area that was a little sleepy, right, for the last 20, 30 years. There's not a lot happening now it is again. And in that sort of that general context of insecurity that has been reintroduced into the system, not just by the United States, right? Obviously, the United States is also reacting in some ways to other developments, right? I mean, the elephant in the room is the rise of China, right? China is at this point a quite formidable competitor in the system. The Chinese are also very happy to fill any vacuum that the United States creates by withdrawing from things. And if you've been following the Davos meeting last week, obviously everybody was focusing on the United States, right? And how, it's a completely new approach to world politics. But if you followed the Chinese representatives, they speak the multilateral talk of the 90s and 2000s, right? It's all about collaboration and finding mutual ground and consensus, and so it's a very different rhetoric, right, from these two big players. But what this means for nuclear security simply is that, okay, now a lot of European countries, for example, are wondering, is this still, are these guarantees? Is the US still an ally, right? That can be trusted? Or do we, I mean, obviously we have to take better care of our own defense, right? But it's going to take time. But should we maybe also think about nuclear rearmament, right? Do we need our own nukes to feel really safe? And that's sort of the problem here, right? That there's talk has started, right? The people are talking to each other, right? There's a range of countries that are thinking about maybe we need nuclear arms, right? Our own. So here you see the current arsenal, right? Everything in gray is retired. Everything in blue is reserve, non-deployed, right? So that's just somewhere in a storage site, basically, right? And then you have red, which is active and deployed, right? So obviously the United States and Russia, are still like way ahead of everybody else, right? But and it is still I mean, we have roughly 200 countries in the world, so this is a very small number of countries that actually have nuclear arms, right? China, France, United Kingdom, India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. Right? That's it. So who will be potential candidates? Like who might actually say, yeah, I'm gonna spend a lot of money and effort to develop my own nuclear arms. South Korea, for obvious reasons, right? If you have a nuclear armed neighbor and also a neighbor that has, I think, the largest standing army in the world, then maybe you want that as an insurance policy, right? Japan, facing China, and so does Australia, right? So if the assumption is if those three, if the first two get them, maybe the Australians would be inclined to jump on board too. In Europe, it's countries that have been mentioned recently were Germany, Poland, some Nordic countries, the Baltic countries, and Turkey. Right? I mean, Turkey has already US a nuclear arms station, right? But the Turks might say, hey, there's Israel and there's Iran, and maybe I should have my own, right? So this is basically the situation. Now, obviously, this is all just talk, right? But I would argue that a certain mental barrier has been transcended, right, or has been passed, right, and it is on the table now, right? People start thinking about this, and that's, to me personally, sort of the scarier part, right? That this is something that now is seriously thought about, right? That we might need that, right? And we don't know at this point what this would mean for non-proliferation, right? Because the idea always was you want to have as few nuclear countries as possible because it's just easier to manage then, right? It's better to control nuclear material and all of that, right? So the more countries acquire nuclear arms, obviously, the more, I mean, it's the argument, the harder it might be to really monitor this tightly, right? And so that's where we are in the moment, right? So just this week, the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the doomsday clock, right? It was moved to 85 seconds to midnight. It's never been closer to midnight. Midnight meaning a massive catastrophe, right? So yeah, that's where we are at this point. And that's the end of my little presentation.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Question, going back to the early part of your nuclear in Ukraine, was that primarily because of the location that they had that many warheads in Ukraine?
You mean, why did the Ukraine have so many warheads in the first place? Yeah, that was for strategic reasons, right? So obviously this was a forward position, right? So that means you can then potentially threaten Great Britain, for example, right? Or that just